That hospital system mentioned in the second reading, Allina Health, has a code of conduct. Under its list of values, it states, without a hint of irony, that Allina Health, and I quote, acts in the best interests of our patients, physicians, communities, and one another. It also has a sort of ethics board called the Institutional Review Board. But as with so many other hospitals, the board does not review its institution, but limits itself to reviewing the ethical compliance of clinical research studies. And as for insider trading by members of Congress, I don't need to mention, but I will, that Martha Stewart went to jail for lying about doing what members of Congress continue to do even today. And if you're wondering, the answer is yes. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives have ethics committees. Now, if you told me that the Ku Klux Klan has an ethics committee, I would have absolutely no reason to doubt you. So what's the problem with ethics anyway? That set of moral principles that should govern our behavior or the conduct of an organization? I have two ideas. One idea has to do with the self-limiting scope and reach of ethics. It's similar to what two business professors, Max Bazerman and Ann Tenbrunsel, call bounded ethicality in their book, Blind Spots. But first, let's have some comic relief before I get too angry. A philosophy professor in California with the delightful name of Eric Schwitzgebel asked this question: do ethicists who spend their time studying and teaching morality, do they behave more ethically than the rest of us? Well, when Professor Schwitzgebel measured ethicists using the yardstick of thou shalt not steal, the answer was, oh dear, a clear no. Let's let Bazerman and Tenbrunsel tell the story, and I quote, surveying 31 leading academic libraries, Schwitzgebel compared the rate at which ethics books were missing from the shelves to the rate at which non-ethics books in philosophy, comparable in age and popularity, were missing. He found that ethics books were more likely to be missing, that is, stolen, than non-ethics books. Next, he examined the presence of fairly obscure philosophical texts that would likely be borrowed only by advanced students and professors. Among those texts, he found that a philosophy book was 50 to 150% more likely to be missing if it was an ethics book than if it was a non-ethics book. End of quote. Bazerman and Tenbrunsel go on to note that Professor Schwitzgebel's research, and I quote again, undercuts the widespread assumption that enrollment in ethics courses will improve students' future ethical behavior. End of quote. So again, what is wrong with ethics? Let's start with what many students of ethics are taught, the runaway trolley scenario, a philosophical dilemma first proposed by the English philosopher Philippa Foot. Okay, so here it is. Imagine you are standing beside some tram tracks. In the distance, you spot a runaway trolley hurtling down the tracks towards 5 workers who cannot hear it coming. Even if they do spot it, they won't be able to move out of the way in time. As the disaster looms, you glance down and see a lever connected to the tracks. You realize that if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted down a second set of tracks away from the 5 unsuspecting workers. However, down this side track is one lone worker, just as oblivious as his colleagues. So, would you pull the lever, leading to 1 death, but saving 5? Okay, I refuse to take the bait and wrestle with this made-up dilemma. Why? Because the scenario is bounded. That is, we are not asked to consider the reason why the trolley's brakes failed. We're not asked to consider why the local city council cut the maintenance budget for the city's trolleys. We're not asked to consider the possibility that those 5 workers may have damaged hearing because the city council refused to include free auditory examinations in the workers' health care contract. Consequences have causes. The time to intervene ethically is before you get to a dilemma, not after you're faced with one. By the way, a city budget is a moral document. It determines who benefits and who suffers. Another example from the book some of you are familiar with from an ethics class held here a few years ago, Justice by Professor Michael J. Sandel. And I quote, "In June 2005, a special forces team of 4 Navy SEALs set out on a secret reconnaissance mission in search of a Taliban leader. Shortly after the special forces team took up a position on a mountain ridge overlooking the village, 2 Afghan farmers and a 14-year-old boy with about 100 bleating goats happened upon them. The Afghans were unarmed. The Americans debated what to do about them. On the one hand, the goat herds appeared to be unarmed civilians. On the other hand, letting them go would run the risk that they would inform the Taliban of the presence of US soldiers. The 4 soldiers realized that they didn't have any rope, so tying up the Afghans to allow time to find a new hideout was not feasible. The only choice was to kill them or let them go free." End of quote. Here again, I'm not taking Professor Sandel's bait. If you read the book by the only surviving SEAL, Marcus Luttrell, you'll realize that Sandel left out a crucial piece of information. The SEALs feared that if they killed the 3 Afghans, they would eventually be accused of murdering unarmed civilians because of the Geneva Convention. As they stood with rifles pointed at the Afghans, they even discussed how they might cover up the murders in case the US liberal media found out about what they did. In his book, Luttrell cusses out his Christian soul for making him cast the deciding vote to let the unarmed Afghans go. But in his book, Luttrell also informs us about a few other things. How little information they actually had about the terrain they were in. How difficult it was to hide on the mountainside because the villagers had been cutting down the trees, probably to be used for firewood. And why didn't the US military ensure that the SEALs had adequate communications before they went in? As the 4 SEALs weighed the fate of the 3 Afghans, they tried in vain to contact their command by radio. And about the issue of not having any rope to tie up the Afghans so that they could get away before the Afghans' absence is noted, which I think was the best option. The SEALs did not consider using the clothes the Afghans wore to tie them up with. At least one of them wore a turban, and the other 2 probably wore the traditional baggy Afghan trousers called the tonban. Both the turban and the tonban would have made good rope if wound tight. Shouldn't the SEALs have been taught that? Now, I bring up these 2 dilemmas in order to point out that philosophers of ethics always seem to want to focus on a specific instance, on a set of circumstances in order to debate the pros and cons of an action. On the one hand, on the other hand, on the third hand, I prefer a wider approach to issues, to pan out, so to speak, and to consider the hidden motivations and circumstances that lead to ethical dilemmas, such as considering the importance of a municipality not neglecting the maintenance of its buses and trolleys, or an army considering the cost of hastily sending troops into a poorly understood corner of Afghanistan. Ethics should be as much about avoidance as about consequences. Here's another instance from Sandel's book, Justice. He wants the reader to consider the ethical issues of military conscription versus an all-volunteer army. He presents cogent arguments on both sides of the issue and frames the discussion as a debate between individual liberty and civic obligation. But what he doesn't touch upon is the issue of why we need a military at all to engage in war. That to me is the ethical issue, a much wider, greater issue than how to stand up an army. If a war is ethically justifiable, such as if your country's invaded, I'm thinking here of Ukraine, then universal conscription seems justifiable. But when the war is unjustified, compelling our young to fight looks awfully unethical. So the moral quandary of conscription versus an all-volunteer military goes away if we avoid unjustifiable wars. And to me, that's the ethical thing to do. Okay, so here's my second problem with ethics. It seems to be treated as a philosophical issue, a debate about how an individual person should properly behave when confronted with a moral dilemma. But ethicists seem not to take into account the advances that psychology and sociology have made in the study of how the environment affects human behavior. In particular, the increasing awareness in science that we are less rational in our decision-making, even about ethical issues, than philosophers assume we are. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, describes a negative impact on our sense of ethics called the priming effect. Kahneman notes that reminders of money produce some troubling effects on study participants. When participants in an experiment are reminded of money, such as by seeing stacks of Monopoly money on a table or using a computer with a screensaver of floating dollar bills, they tended to be more selfish. And then there's the influence of other people. The psychologist Dan Ariely, in his book entitled The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, conducted a series of experiments with university students in which he had them complete a test in a classroom setting and paid them money for each correct answer they got. Ariely noticed that when given a chance, the students tended to cheat a little when they believed they wouldn't be found out. Through many such tests, Ariely concluded that people in general cheat just a little bit, as long as such cheating doesn't hinder their self-image as honest people. But Ariely also conducted similar experiments with lone individuals, taxi drivers and shopkeepers, who were given the opportunity to cheat a blind customer. However, here, the lone individuals did not cheat at all, including the taxi drivers. Ariely fails to compare the honest behavior of these lone individuals to the slightly dishonest behavior of the group of students in a classroom setting. But I want to, and I conclude that dishonest behavior is more prevalent when we act as a group than when we act alone. In 2006, William Phelps of the University of Washington Business School published a paper about the negative effect of one bad apple in a department that can have in the functioning of that department. He got the idea for the paper from his wife. She was unhappy at work and characterized the environment as cold and unfriendly. Then she said a funny thing happened. One of her co-workers, who was particularly caustic and was always making fun of other people at the office, he came down with an illness that caused him to be away for several days. And when he was gone, his wife said that the atmosphere of the office changed dramatically. People started helping each other and went out for drinks together after work. But when the caustic colleague returned to the office, things returned to the unpleasant way they were. His wife concluded that this fellow truly was the bad apple that spoiled the barrel. But can a bad apple affect our moral behavior? Let's ask Dan Ariely. He performed a number of experiments and noted that yes, when his subjects observed a colleague cheating, they tended to cheat more. So yes, unethical behavior can be contagious. And finally, let's consider our place of work. The management theorist Edgar Schein published a paper in 1996 in which he proposed that organizations have three subcultures: the operator culture, the engineering culture, and the executive culture. The operator culture is where the organization's work is done. The bank tellers, the factory workers, the customer service representatives, etc. According to Shine, in the operator culture, among other things, employees depend on each other and thus value collaboration. It is a very ethical environment. In the next level up, the engineering culture, employees design the technology and methodology of the organization. They see things in a more abstract way. According to Shine, in this culture, and I quote, people are the problem. They make mistakes and hence should be designed out of the system whenever possible, end of quote. The executive culture is where the CEO and her subordinates operate. Shine says that in this culture, and I quote, though people are necessary, they are a necessary evil, not an intrinsic value. People are a resource, like other resources, to be acquired and managed, not ends in themselves, end of quote. I find Edgar Shine's 1996 paper astonishing, especially since Edgar Shine was for many years a leader in the field of organizational culture. Edgar Shine's astute analysis helps us understand why CEOs, when left unchecked, often create toxic environments that lead to unethical and even criminal behavior. Okay, so at this point, I can hear you all asking, what then should we do to lead an ethical life? Well, I thought you'd never ask. I happen to have 3 simple ideas. 1, choose your friends and your environment carefully. It's not quite true that birds of a feather flock together. It's rather the other way around. Birds that flock together become of a feather. So if you chose NSUC as your spiritual home, I salute you. You've chosen well. 2, individual persons, if left alone, are mostly ethical and kind, but organizations are at best amoral and often immoral. The neuroscientist Donald Pfaff, in a book entitled The Altruistic Brain, marshals neuroscience research to explain how the brains of humans are wired to be naturally good. But of course, they're subject to toxic influences. So, fight for regulations and laws that control the power and behavior of organizations, especially large ones. And don't think they can't influence you negatively. Finally, in the Christian prayer, the Our Father, is the line, lead us not into temptation. I believe that it's easier to avoid temptation than to resist it. We all have a weak sense of ethics. Avoiding situations that lead us to act immorally may be the most ethical thing we can do. And that means professors of ethics should stay away from libraries. Thank you.